Today we live amid a cottage industry of conspiracy theories. But here's an old one that goes back to the 1940s. And this was the idea that the President Franklin Roosevelt knew the Japanese were going to bomb Pearl Harbor and let them do it anyway. The rationale is that he wanted a declaration of war from Congress, and Congress was reluctant because the American people were overwhelmingly against getting involved with what we now call World War II. According to the Constitution, only Congress has the authority to declare war. Some presidents have violated that, but that's another story. Here's the context. Western imperialism, Western colonies in East Asia, South Asia, other parts of the world too. But anyway, here we have the English in India, we have the French in Indochina, we have the Dutch in Indonesia, the Spanish had the Philippines until the Americans took it, and there are other colonies not shown on this map. But the amazing thing is the Japanese avoided being colonized. And not only did they avoid being colonized, they became colonizers. So they start moving into their neighbors' territory, sort of fulfilling that old saying, if you can't beat them, join them. Early 1900s, Taiwan and Korea, then in the 1930s, Northeast Asia, and then the invasion of China in 1937. So World War II begins in 1937 for the Chinese. By 1941, Japan has taken the French colony of Indochina away from them and basically made it their own colony. And at that point, the United States froze their assets. And then in September, they declared an oil embargo, which some people considered the equivalent of a declaration of war. The reason being Japan was an industrialized country, but they're getting all their oil from Indonesia. So you cut off the oil supply to any industrialized nation, and the economy is going to crash, and people are going to starve, etc. So the oil embargo begins in September of 1941. By October, the militarists have overtaken the Japanese government, much as the Nazis overtook the German government, and they're the ones that execute the Pearl Harbor attack. Here's part of the problem there. This is just a partial list of possible targets for the Japanese attack. In the lower left, we have the Philippines, which, as I mentioned, was an American colony. Clark Air Base was there. But we had naval bases and refueling stations at Guam, Wake Island, Midway, Dutch Harbor, and of course Pearl Harbor. So any one of these places could have been a target, and other places too, like Samoa. The Americans were all over the Pacific. So there's just an example of Pearl Harbor, the USS Shaw being bombed, and the USS California being bombed. Over 2,400 people were killed in the Pearl Harbor attack, and over 1,700 wounded. Here's an early study from 1962 debunking the Pearl Harbor conspiracy theory. At this point, there were 39 volumes of congressional hearings. Congress was very interested in the Pearl Harbor phenomena, and right after the war, they investigated. She also looked at presidential papers, war crime trial transcripts. People like General Tojo was apologetic before they executed him. Tons and tons and tons of military intelligence. Now, the military intelligence concluded at the time that Thailand would be a pretty easy target for the Japanese, that the Clark Air Base in the Philippines would be more risky, and the attack on Pearl Harbor riskier still, partly because it's so far away. So much information, but what did it mean at the time? And I underline this because historians try to put themselves into the shoes of the people they're studying, which is easier said than done. And here's her conclusion. We failed to anticipate Pearl Harbor not for want of relevant materials, but because of a plethora of irrelevant ones. So that's the issue. It's not just the tons and tons of military intel, but often in warfare, the enemy will deliberately generate false information to try to mislead their opponent. So that's 1962. Fast forward to 1999, we have David Kennedy's great book, Freedom from Fear, about the Great Depression and World War II. And I underline the part where he's just merely reaffirming the debunking of the Pearl Harbor conspiracy theory. Part of the problem is the phrase, conspiracy theory. It's not really a theory. It's certainly not a scientific theory. Some of them are comparatively harmless. We might call those ideas or notions. Some of them are very harmful, that involve propaganda or the product of a paranoid imagination. But all of them have something in common, and that is they start with a conclusion, and they have no evidence to support that conclusion. So contrast that with scholarly research, which begins with a question or a set of questions which you might modify as your research progresses. But here's a crucial part. It relies upon empiricism. And that means going to the horse's mouth. That means studying the evidence for yourself, just as Roberta Wohlstetter did in the archives, looking at all that raw material. And this is why if you take a science class, they'll have you take the lab so that you can get a taste of empiricism and looking at primary evidence. So the scholarly research approach is practically the polar opposite of the conspiracy theory approach.